Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it.
So how do we know God exists? Well, when you look at creation, you don't believe there was a creator. You know there was a creator because creation couldn't create itself. That's a scientific impossibility. For nature to make itself, it had to be pre-existent to make itself before it made itself, which is scientifically ludicrous.
He calls it a creation and says that creation obviously requires a creator. Yes, that's true. If something is a creation, it obviously has a creator. But this is begging the question. You're assuming your conclusion in your question. It is nonsense. Your question is, does the creation of the earth require a creator? Well, of course it does, because it's a creation, and creations require creators. Well, isn't that nifty, folks? Calling it a creation, asserting that it's a creation, and so therefore it requires a creator. This is hot, steaming, assertive, fallacious garbage.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arm.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all most welcome to another episode of the most annoying religious people. And annoying he is indeed. I'm speaking, of course, about the Christian apologist Ray Comfort, a man who has dedicated his life to fallacies and illogicality. No, of course, that's an uncharitable description. Of course, Ray Comfort is a sincere believer, and he has dedicated his life to doing the Lord's work, as he might put it. But unfortunately, his arguments are lacking, and he has a kind of self-fulfilled smugness, a kind of an arrogance about him. An arrogance that I'm sad to say is quite common amongst the religious apologist community. There's this kind of universal smugness and arrogance and know-it-allness that seems to pervade their psychology. But look, it's all a matter of opinion. Perhaps my interpretation there, or my perspective, is just born of my own failings as a human being. As always, dear listener, you can be the judge. But without further ado, we're going to jump into one of Ray Comfort's speeches here. And the funny thing about this speech, and remember this before we dive into it, the title of this speech is How to Reach Atheists with the Gospel. So this is Ray Comfort's very own how-to guide in terms of how to reach people like me, how to convince people like me, or you, dear listener, because I have no doubt that the majority of my audience are atheist skeptic types, albeit there are some Christians among you, and you're very welcome also, dear listeners. I'm very happy to have both atheists and theists watching my content. To be honest, I prefer it that way, because the theists are going to try and hold my feet to the fire. I mean, atheists, you guys do it too. You guys really do hold my feet to the fire, I must say. But theists have more of a biased interest in resisting my arguments. So this is a very long way of saying welcome to all of you. And so with all that said and out of the way, let's dive into Ray Comfort's speech here and see if his ideas about how to reach atheists are good, bad, or indifferent. Let's just say, and this is probably obvious given the title of this series, but let's just say that his speech here is pretty damn annoying. But like I said, dear listener, you can be the judge. Let's dive right in.
It's been well said that you are unique, just like everyone else. And it's true, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. And I often think to myself, especially when I see vast crowds, how incredible God is. And I say this reverently, he's only got a nose, 2 eyes, and a mouth to work with, and yet we all look differently. And yet We're unique. The Bible says in Psalm 33, verse 15, God fashions their hearts alike. In other words, we may look the same, but we're different. And we're the same physically. When a surgeon opens us up, he doesn't go looking for the spleen or looking for the heart or the kidneys or the pancreas. He knows exactly where everything is because God's fashioned our hearts alike and have made us physically.
So Ray Comfort has never heard of genetics, it would seem. This really is the bottom of the barrel, and we've only just begun. And remember, this is his speech on how to reach atheists. But because we open up every human being and we find their heart and their lungs and their organs in the same place as everybody else, glory be to God. And by the way, that's not even true. I'm sorry to go argument from evil on your ass, Mr. Comfort, but no, not everybody's organs are in the same place. And sorry to bring the mood down here, dear listener, for a moment, but what about the people whose hearts are born outside their bodies? Suffice to say, no, things aren't always where we expect them to be. They're just not. There are terrible, albeit rare, and tragic cases of where children are born with various organs that are not in the correct place. Sometimes this results in very, very early on death, right? And so, yeah, not everything is in the right place. And you gotta question, why would it be that way? Why is our genetic code subject to this kind of error? Why is our genetic code subject to this kind of horrendous outcome where people suffer unbelievably, where people suffer in an ugly, brutal, and unpleasant fashion? So no, Mr. Comfort, I'm sorry, but, and I'm not trying to be glass half empty here, but it is just the case that things aren't always where they're supposed to be. Even if we just ignore all of the cases that conflict with your worldview, even if we ignore all of the tragedies that I've just referred to, let's just assume that you're correct for a moment and everything is always where it's supposed to be. This is evidence of a God? We actually have a pretty strong and fundamental understanding of genetics and procreation and DNA and how the DNA uncoils and recoils to produce a new person and all the rest of it. We know how fetal development occurs, and it's not surprising that the offspring of two human parents resembles those human parents with organs being in the same location and so forth, right? I mean, why does any of this require a God? In the words of Pierre-Simon Laplace, it works without that assumption, which is to say that the genetic code and how human beings are born and how we develop over time and how our bodies grow and how our organs end up where they are, all of that functions without the assumption of a divine agent. And in fact, if we invoke a divine agent, as I've already pointed out, all you're doing really is invoking the problem of evil, where you now are in the position where you have to explain all of the cases that conflict with your worldview. Does God make it such that some people are born with deformities and where organs aren't in the right place? Is God responsible for that? Presumably he is, given the fact that he's in control over everything. So then the question becomes, why would God permit that? Why would God allow that? Is God evil? Is he a scumbag? Does he just not care? Or is he impotent? Is he unable to prevent these outcomes? Does God's power have limits? Which is something that Mr. Ray Comfort is not going to entertain for a second. And to be quite honest, I think the answers to all of those questions are just utterly masturbatory, because the truth is, you have no evidence for your God, Mr. Comfort. You have absolutely zero evidence. Zero evidence. All you're doing here is spouting assertions. And the entire argument you're making is laughable to begin with. The idea that our organs being in the places that they are, the fact that there's uniformity in genetics, that proves a God. Really? All right. Well, do you have anything else to offer other than assertions? Because if it's only going to be assertions, Mr. Comfort, this speech wherein you're going to explain how to bring the gospel to atheists, I suspect it's going to be a failure. But let's move on.
I've even heard atheists say, atheism has never killed anybody. Well, they needed to do their homework also. Jeffrey Dahmer, who was an atheist, who killed and ate 17 people, said this: if a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep within acceptable ranges? Reverend Jim Jones, remember Reverend Jim Jones, responsible for 900 deaths back in 1976? That reverend was an atheist. This is what he said. He told the FBI, "My bishop knows I'm an atheist. He must have spent $20,000 traveling around hoping to get my denomination to remove me because I was so atheistic." Then there were the atheists of Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, Pol Pot, Mao, who were responsible for more than 100 million deaths under communism. And that's because if there's no God, there's no ultimate right or wrong. So anything goes.
This is just the oldest and lamest and weakest argument in the theist playbook. And again, can I just remind you, this is his speech where he's going to try and show us how to bring atheists to the gospel. By telling them that they're murderers, by telling them that atheism is going to lead them to genocide and wickedness and immorality. Not a very persuasive technique, Mr. Comfort, but let's address your point. Guys, there is a difference between being an atheist who has done something wrong, or being an atheist who has done something wrong because of atheism. Those are two very, very different things. Let me sketch out an analogy here, all right? If a Christian is speeding on the motorway or the highway and they get pulled in by the police, am I going to say that that law that they've broken is another mark against Christianity? It's another example of Christian evil in the world? Of course not. The person who's speeding on the highway or motorway is doing something wrong. Not only is it against the law, but I think it's actually immoral. Assuming that there was no prescient reason for them speeding, assuming there wasn't a medical emergency and they were just speeding, say, because they enjoy the thrill of going fast, right? Let's imagine that's the case. That is immoral. Because by speeding in that way, you're risking your own life and the lives of others. You're reducing your ability to brake on time should something unexpected occur, yada, yada, yada. You don't need a driving school lesson from Magic Skeptic. Suffice to say, I'm sure we could all agree that speeding, simply for the thrill of speed, on a public highway is immoral. It's a disgusting and despicable thing to do. Fine. If a Christian gets caught doing just that, I do not count that as a mark against Christianity. The fact that they're Christian here is incidental. It's utterly irrelevant. The question is, has their Christianity played a causal role in them speeding? And in this case, no, because I've already clarified why they're doing it. They're doing it for the thrill of the speed, right? They're doing it because they're an adrenaline junkie or something of that nature. So Christianity gets off scot-free in this scenario, in this particular instance of wrongdoing, because the Christianity of the person who's doing the wrong thing was not a motivational factor in their immoral behavior. Now, if we switch to another example and we go to the Christian who takes the Old Testament seriously and all of the statements about how homosexuality is an abomination and how homosexuals should be stoned to death. Let's take a very hyperbolic example and imagine that a Christian assaults a gay person because of what it says in the Bible, because of the immorality of homosexuality according to the Bible. In that particular case, we can see that Christianity has played a causal role in the immoral behavior, and so that does fall squarely at the foot of Christianity. The religion has played a role in the wrongdoing. And so we might say that this is an example of religious bigotry. It's an example of religious immorality. Taking that principle, guys, and applying it to atheism, the question is, was atheism a causal factor in Jeffrey Dahmer's cannibalism? Of course not! The fact that you can cherry pick a random quote about Jeffrey Dahmer talking about how there's no accountability if there's no God is irrelevant. Jeffrey Dahmer was a psychopath. If you're going to ignore his psychopathy and place his immorality at the foot of atheism, you're a moron. You're an absolute idiot. This is garbage. This is the equivalent of taking the speeding example and just making it an atheist. Ray Comfort is the kind of guy who says, see, look, atheists are evil. That atheist was speeding on the motorway. How dare they? Another crime in the name of atheism has been carried out. This is garbage. This is utterly ridiculous. And the fact that anybody takes this kind of thinking seriously is bewildering to me. Jeffrey Dahmer did what he did because he was a psychopath. He was an unbelievable lunatic. It had nothing to do with his atheism. But look, let's take some of the other cases he's brought up. The crimes of the 20th century. Let's look at Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, all of the rest of it. Did they do what they did because of atheism? Is there a causal link between what they did and atheism? And the answer, guys, is no. They were obviously psychopathic as well. They were completely caught up in their own cult of personalities. What they enforced was something like a state religion, in fact. Right? They were motivated by a political ideology. Sure, they were atheists, but can you draw a causal link between their atheism and what they did? No, that's nonsense. This makes no sense. What you have is a correlation. Yes, Stalin was an atheist, but Stalin also had a mustache. So did Hitler, right? So I've identified a mustache in the case of Adolf Hitler and Stalin, so therefore the mustache is the thing that caused them to do what they did. This is bullshit. Correlation does not equate with causation. This is the fallacy at the root of Ray Comfort's thinking. This is why he might be tempted to call the atheist who's speeding on the motorway immoral because of their atheism. He has seen a correlation between somebody who's breaking the speeding laws and atheism, and so therefore there must be a causal connection. You don't just get to assert that. If you're going to say that the person speeding on the motorway is doing so because of their atheism, you have to demonstrate that causal connection. You can't just assert it. And pointing out other examples of atheists who were also speeding on the motorway doesn't get you to the causal connection. It's still just a correlation. So the question is, can you provide evidence of the causal link between atheism and the crimes of the 20th century? And nobody has ever successfully done that. Yes, they were atheists, but they were also men. That's another correlation. So it is their masculinity that led to the crimes that they committed. There's all sorts of correlations that we can establish. The question is, can you link them in a causal manner? And I'm sorry, Mr. Comfort, but an assertion isn't going to cut it. It's very obvious to me and many historians that the crimes of the 20th century were explained, or can be explained, by political extremists. These were political ideologies that, in my view, were actually frightfully similar to religions. The idea that atheism plays a causal role in the crimes of the 20th century is just hot steaming garbage. It is an assertion and nothing more. And, you know, it's laughable. The idea that atheism played a role in the crimes of the cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer, it's just utterly ridiculous, guys, and you shouldn't take it seriously. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed as such. And so I'm going to dismiss this and move on. Goodness gracious me, you're going to have to do a hell of a lot better if you're going to bring some atheists to the gospel, Ray Comfort. Perhaps don't start by calling them genocidal, cannibalistic maniacs. There's some advice for you. That's for free. Let's move on.
Another very common argument or reason for atheism is this: suffering proves there's no God. Imagine you buy a brand new Toyota SUV, and you think to yourself, as you look at the panel and everything's state of the art, you think Toyota did a wonderful job. So you take some friends for a ride, and as you're driving, the accelerator gets stuck. You say, that's crazy. Well, it happened back in 2010. CBS reported unintended acceleration in Toyota vehicles may have been involved in the deaths of 89 people in the past decade. And so the accelerator gets stuck in this brand new Toyota, and you crash into the front of a car that had stopped, the back of a car that stopped at traffic lights. And you regain consciousness a few seconds later, you see bodies all over the road, and you hear people groaning in agony. And you look at the suffering and you say, look at the suffering. Therefore, nobody made my SUV. That's a crazy leap of logic. Just because there was suffering, you don't leap from praising Toyota to saying Toyota doesn't exist. No, the right thing, the logical thing to do is you look at the suffering and say, something went terribly wrong.
This analogy is just out of this world dumb. I don't believe he just said this. Yes, Mr. Comfort, of course. If my Toyota malfunctions, I'm not going to come to the conclusion that therefore it doesn't have a creator. Of course not. Of course not. But what I am going to do is come to the conclusion that the Toyota has a bad creator, a creator that made mistakes, a creator that's responsible for the deaths of those 89 people. That's the conclusion we arrive at. And that's what atheists say about God, right? What they're doing is telling you what the options are. So let's take the Toyota and turn it into the universe. The universe clearly contains terrible design, just like the terrible design of the Toyota. The thing is, we have evidence that cars are created. You can go to the car factory, you can watch them being assembled. We know that cars are the product of human intelligence and cognition. We know that human beings build them, we know that human beings drive them, and we know that human beings are fallible creatures. So when my car malfunctions, and if somebody tragically dies as a consequence, I don't come to the conclusion that therefore there's no designer for the car, because I have an embarrassment of evidence which suggests that the car is the product of a designer, a creator that made mistakes. When it comes to the universe, this analogy doesn't function at all, because we have no evidence that the universe is the product of a designer or a creator. Atheists haven't come to the conclusion that there's no designer simply because there's evil in the world. They've come to the conclusion that there's no designer or creator for the universe because there's no evidence for a designer or a creator of the universe. Atheists bring up the problem of evil after that to try and illustrate to you that there's a conflict between your theology, the God that you're claiming exists, that God's characteristics, and the design that that God allegedly produced. So you've got this so muddled in your head, Mr. Comfort. Atheists are not saying that the design flaws make the existence of a designer impossible. What they're saying is that these design flaws make the existence of your chosen designer highly improbable. There is a very big difference there. This is why I don't use the problem of evil, because the problem of evil doesn't actually rule out a designer. It just rules out an all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful designer. There could just be a psychopathic designer, an evil designer. The earth is perfectly consistent with the existence of a designer with those characteristics. Maybe there's just an all-knowing, all-powerful, divine Adolf Hitler in the sky, and he's standing there with folded arms watching us as we wander around and suffer and feel misery and sadness and pain, and he sits there enjoying it like the psychopath he is. This is what the problem of evil leads us to. It doesn't necessarily lead us to the non-existence of a designer. It just leads us to the non-existence of your chosen designer. And that's why your argument fails, Mr. Comfort. Atheists are not the people saying that the Toyota doesn't have a designer simply because it contains design flaws. Atheists are the people who are saying that the designer of the Toyota clearly screwed up, that the designer of the Toyota clearly isn't all-knowing, and on the assumption that the designer of the Toyota is all-knowing, then they knowingly created the Toyota with the design flaw that was going to claim the lives of those 89 people, which would mean that that designer of the Toyota cannot possibly be called all-loving. And so we're left with this miserable analogy of his, an analogy that fails at every conceivable front and serves as nothing other than a demonstration of Mr. Comfort's ignorance. But anyway, let's move on.
And as we look at creation, we see the genius of God's creative hand through the order of creation, from the atom to the universe. Flowers, birds, trees, the sun, the moon, the stars, the marvels of the human eye, love and laughter, music and color, the sky, all around us, we see the genius of God's creative hand. Everything is fearfully and wonderfully made.
The sheer blindness that's on display here is absolutely shocking to me. He says that the wonder of God's creation is visible everywhere, from the atom to the largest star. He just seems oblivious to the madness that's going on in the world. I thought it was particularly funny that he mentioned the human eye.
The marvels of the human eye.
Himself a man who's wearing glasses. Yes, God designed the eye so brilliantly, Mr. Comfort, that you require corrective lenses. Wow. Wow. This is unbelievable. I just, like, what are you supposed to say to this? What are you actually supposed to say to this? This is the equivalent of a person standing in their home. Their house is on fire and it's burning down around them. And they're standing there telling you, look how lovely my house is. Look how brilliant it is. Isn't it just a lovely house? It's just the best house ever. Anyway, I'm just going to go sit down on the couch and relax and just, bask in the glory of my house while the house is burning down around them. Right? There's a level of obliviousness. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, I'm not sure. I don't know if he's just, pretending here. But if he's genuinely oblivious to the amount of suffering that's going on in the world, he thinks that the world is some kind of a marvelous or perfect creation. The human eye and he himself wearing glasses. He talks about the smallest atom to the largest star. Stars that eventually burn out, including our very own sun, by the way. Our very own sun will eventually extinguish, and when it does, all life on planet Earth will ultimately end, because without the sun, there will be no more photosynthesis, which means that all of the plants will die.
We see the genius of God's creative hand.
All of the animals that then eat those plants will die.
We see the genius of God's creative hand.
Then all of the animals that eat a combination of those animals and plants will die.
We see the genius of God's creative hand.
And then ultimately we will die because we eat a combination of plants and animals. Eventually all life on Earth will extinguish, one way or another.
We see the genius of God's creative hand.
Some design. What an incredible design. That's if a solar flare doesn't kill us before that happens. Right? I mean, this is just absolutely ridiculous. This is just so dumb. A 5-year-old could look at the world and tell you the problems, at least some of them, that I'm describing. The disease, how the laws of physics produce hurricanes, tsunamis, volcanoes, and all of the rest of it. But no, Mr. Comfort alleges, through the eyes of a person wearing glasses, that everything that God designed is perfect and amazing and brilliant. Says the man wearing corrective lenses for the eyes that the Almighty designed for him. Eyes that are all too subject to various maladies, including the necessity for corrective lenses. Give me a break.
So if we look at suffering, it's illogical to say, oh, look at all the suffering, therefore nothing created everything. That's not logical. The logical conclusion would be, look at all the suffering, therefore something has gone terribly wrong.
What a big, fat, juicy straw man. Look at all this suffering, therefore nothing created everything. Said no atheist ever. Are you kidding me? Nothing created everything. Does he really think that that's the atheist position? Do you want to know my position as an atheist, Mr. Comfort? I don't know why there is something rather than nothing. Scientists don't know either. The Big Bang doesn't explain the origin of everything. The Big Bang explains the origin of our local universe. The cosmos, which is everything, may very well be a separate question. We don't know. There might just always have been something. The past might just be infinite. Am I saying that that's the case? No, I'm hypothesizing here. Again, my answer is I don't know. I'm certainly not prepared to say that nothing created everything. What are you talking about, Mr. Comfort? And I'm certainly not going to say that nothing created everything just because there's suffering in the world. Remember, guys, the existence of suffering doesn't necessarily lead one to the conclusion that there isn't a designer. It just might mean that that designer isn't a particularly good one, which would rule out Mr. Comfort's God. But again, I don't know. And any atheist I've ever met has admitted that same thing. Because here's the thing, which is contrary to popular belief among Christians like Mr. Comfort. Atheists are actually showing humility. They're admitting what they don't know. It would be lovely, Mr. Comfort, if you would engage in a similar form of humility. But no. You're the guy who knows the creator of the universe. You're the guy who knows his plan. You're the guy who knows and has a personal relationship with the creator of the universe. You're the guy who can pray to that creator. You're the guy who knows the answers to all of the questions that scientists and honest, humble people will admit that they don't know the answer to. So go ahead, O wise one. Tell us of your wisdom. Tell us, O wise one. Take it away.
The Bible says we live in a fallen creation. The book of Romans tells us the whole of creation groans in travail, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. When it comes to suffering, my big problem isn't why is there suffering. I look at the suffering and I say, man, this is proof that we live in a fallen creation. If I watch the news at night and I see terrible things happening throughout the world, I don't think there's no God. I just think that confirms exactly what the Bible says. We live in a fallen creation with disease, pain, suffering, and death. What concerns me is why God allows suffering. Why does God allow it?
There you go. That's your reason, folks. The reason your loved ones are in hospital with terrible illnesses. The reason that people around the world die in terrible circumstances, in volcanoes and hurricanes and tsunamis, is because we live in a fallen world, which is an appeal to the narrative, the mythological narrative of Adam and Eve. That's the level we're at, folks. So the reason we all suffer in untold agony and misery is because the first two humans screwed up in the Garden of Eden. And so God decided in his ultimate wisdom, in his benevolence, in his all-knowing, all-wise manner, God decided that every generation of human, from now until the end of time, has to jump through these burning hoops of fire. Every human being, from now on, is condemned to live in a fallen world that features misery and suffering. That is the wisdom of the Bible. We all deserve to be in this terrible fallen world. We all deserve to suffer because two humans screwed up at the start of time. Or before time, depending on how you want to explain it. There you go. Sounds pretty damn loving, wouldn't you say? I just feel so loved to be condemned because of the wrongdoing of somebody else. Wrongdoing, I might add, that God set them up for. God puts Adam and Eve in the garden alongside the tree with foreknowledge of the future because he's all-knowing, knowing that the serpent is there, knowing that the tree is there, knowing that they're going to be subject to this temptation. And then he punishes them for it anyway, knowing full well that it was going to happen. This, in my view, is the equivalent of taking your dog, leaving them on their own in the kitchen with a big juicy steak on the floor, and telling the dog, don't you dare touch the steak. Don't you dare. I'm going to leave now for 6 hours. If I come back and there's even a bite gone out of that steak, I'm going to torture you. Sure enough, you leave and return 6 hours later and the dog has taken a bite or devoured the steak, because that is simply in the nature of a dog. And then I proceed to kick the living daylights out of the poor, innocent animal that I set up for failure. And just to make it even more compatible here as an analogy, not only have I left the dog alone in the house with the steak, but I have also left my child there, who I know is going to antagonize the dog with the steak. My child then takes the dog over to the steak, holds the steak up to the dog's nose and says, oh, wouldn't it be lovely to eat it? Holds the steak up to his nose, encourages him, go on, eat it, it's lovely, it's delicious. And then, of course, the dog ultimately gives in because of the temptation. What I then proceed to do is punish every descendant of that dog for the rest of time. Every single time that dog gives birth to a new pup, I now beat the crap out of that new pup as well. I now, put that pup in a terrible situation of hunger and suffering and misery. And then every other pup that ever comes from that lineage, I give them that same treatment because the original pup, because the original dog that was put in that position failed because I set them up for failure. That is the theology and the wisdom of the Genesis account of Adam and Eve. And Mr. Comfort is going to apologize. He is going to explain away your suffering. Anybody here who's watching this channel right now who's suffering with a terrible illness, it's Adam and Eve. They're responsible. And Ray Comfort thinks that God has done the right thing by punishing you with whatever malady you have. Every single person is going to die this week screaming in agony in a terminal wing. Every single person is going to die this week because of a hurricane or a volcano. Can't imagine volcanoes are particularly common, but I know that hurricanes and tsunamis in certain parts of the world are in fact a commonality. Whatever the case may be, every single person who dies in utter misery, fear, and pain, every single one of those deserved it because of Adam and Eve, the people that God in his ultimate wisdom set up for failure, just like the dog in my kitchen. You tell me, dear listener, but I think this is just absolute moral nonsense. It is wicked, abhorrent, and despicable. And to be quite honest, I've probably spent too much time on it, so let's move on.
For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. So when I meet an atheist, firstly I say to him, so you're an atheist, you believe the scientific impossibility that nothing created everything. Usually when confronted with that, they say, I don't believe that nothing created everything. I believe there was kind of something. So they're not really atheist, they're more agnostic. But I say to them, see that building over there, what evidence there was there that was a builder? And they usually say, well, the building's there. And it's true. The building is absolute 100% proof, evidence there was a builder. You couldn't want better proof there was a builder than to have the building as evidence. You don't even need to see the builder. He could have been dead for 100 years, but you don't believe there was a builder. You know there was a builder because buildings don't build themselves. It's the same with paintings and painters. When you look at a painting, it could be a 200-year-old painting. And you know the painter existed because the painting is there, because paintings don't build themselves. So how do we know God exists? Well, when you look at creation, you don't believe there was a creator. You know there was a creator because creation couldn't create itself. That's a scientific impossibility. For nature to make itself, it had to be pre-existent to make itself before it made itself, which is scientifically ludicrous.
Oh, don't you just love it when Christians speak on behalf of atheists? I always find that they manage to somehow misrepresent us, wouldn't you say? Atheists, the people who believe the scientific impossibility that nothing created everything.
So you're an atheist, you believe the scientific impossibility that nothing created everything.
What he's talking about here and what he's appealing to is the rule of cause and effect that governs our reality. Yes, in our reality, it does appear to be reasonable to conclude that it's impossible for something to come from nothing, which is to say that it's impossible for there to be an effect which exists without a cause. That appears to be a universal rule in our reality. Fine. If indeed there was at one point nothing, why would we assume that the rule of cause and effect applies? Why would you assume that? If there's really nothing, then the rule of cause and effect can't be there, because then there'd be something there. It would mean that this nothingness is governed by some rule, but it's not really nothingness then. It's actually just some kind of a vacuum that includes the rule of cause and effect. If indeed there was at one point nothing, to say that it's impossible for that nothing to become something is to assume that the rule of cause and effect applies. But if there really is nothing, the rule of cause and effect cannot possibly apply. And if the rule of cause and effect doesn't apply, then surely it's possible for there to be an effect that is causeless. That is possible, theoretically speaking, if indeed the rule of cause and effect doesn't apply. So this idea that it's a scientific impossibility for something to come from nothing is something that Mr. Comfort would have to demonstrate, but he can't demonstrate that. It's just a big fat assertion. But I guess we shouldn't be surprised, because much of what he said in this speech is assertive. But let's take it a little bit further.
The building is absolute 100% proof, evidence there was a builder. You couldn't want better proof there was a builder than to have the building as evidence.
No, Mr. Comfort, the reason we know that the building has a designer is not just because the building is there. That's not how we arrive at that conclusion. The reason we know that the building has a designer or a creator is because we have evidence of buildings being designed and being created. You can go to a building site and watch human beings assemble a building brick by brick. You can see it happening with your very own eyes. We have an embarrassment of evidence which suggests that buildings are the product of human creation. It's that simple. So the question then becomes, do we have evidence that the universe is the product of creation? Something that was built, metaphorically speaking, brick by brick. And the answer to that question is no. We don't have evidence that the universe is a creation. Go to the painter example.
It's the same with paintings and painters. When you look at a painting, it could be a 200-year-old painting. And you know the painter existed because the painting is there, because paintings don't build themselves.
The reason we know that paintings are the product of painters is, again, you can watch painters painting a painting. Even if you didn't see the event happen in front of your eyes, you could examine the painting and see the brush strokes. You could go to an art shop and buy paint brushes. You can watch videos of people doing paintings. You can go to art class. There is an embarrassment of evidence, once again, that paintings are the products of painters. Is there any evidence that the universe is a creation that was, metaphorically speaking, painted by a painter? And again, the answer is no. He calls it a creation and says that creation obviously requires a creator. Yes, that's true. If something is a creation, it obviously has a creator. But this is begging the question. You're assuming your conclusion in your question. It is nonsense. Your question is, does the creation of the earth require a creator? Well, of course it does, because it's a creation, and creations require creators. Well, isn't that nifty, folks? Calling it a creation, asserting that it's a creation, and so therefore it requires a creator. This is hot, steaming, assertive, fallacious garbage. You don't just get to assert that it is a creation, Mr. Comfort. You have to demonstrate that the universe is a creation. After you've demonstrated that it's a creation, then I will entertain your hypothesis that it has a creator, and we could begin discussing the nature of who or what that creator is. But you have to do the work first. You have to demonstrate that there is in fact a creator involved. You have to demonstrate that the universe is in fact a creation. You haven't done that, and asserting it doesn't make it so. The mere existence of the universe doesn't point to a creator. The mere existence of a building doesn't point to a creator. It's the evidence where the building is concerned that points to a creator. It's the evidence where a painting is concerned that points to a painter. What is the evidence vis-a-vis the universe being a creation? He hasn't provided any. All he's going to do is defer to his magical book of spells, which alleges that the universe was created by his god, and bingo, you've got yourself a creationist. Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Comfort, but you're going to have to do better than that. Philosophers and atheists like myself expect something called evidence. 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 Have you heard of it? Because it doesn't seem like you have.
I use apologetics all the time. I use it to get a crowd when I'm open air preaching. We have an evidence Bible that is pregnant with apologetical arguments, legitimate, but apologetics I see as bait. The commandments are the hook. And if you go fishing with bait and no hook, you're going to end up with fat, happy fish that get away. What you want to do is use the bait to get them nibbling. And once they're nibbling, you say, do you think you're a good person? and take them through the moral law to bring the knowledge of sin and show them they need the Savior. Because our agenda is not to convince somebody that God exists. They already know that. Our agenda is to see them saved from a very real hell. That's what we want to see happen to every atheist. We love them, we care about them. We're not trying to win an argument. We're trying to win them to Christ so that death won't seize upon them and they received a just desert for their sin.
So bringing this video to a close then, we could watch more of this speech, but the truth is it's an hour long and my own video here is already becoming quite bloated, so I'll finish on this point. He alleges that his apologetics arguments are like the bait, but the hook is the commandments, it's the word, it's the gospel.
Apologetics I see as bait. The commandments are the hook.
Well, Mr. Comfort, if your arguments are the bait, you are in the wrong game, my friend. I mean, I don't know what to tell you, because I am not enticed at all by your alleged bait. I'll tell you what you've done here. Rather than hook a worm, or rather than putting a fly on the top of a river using your fishing rod, you're the kind of idiot who showed up with just a piece of string, and you put the string into the water and you're expecting the trout or the fish to be interested in it. There is no bait on your hook. It's all hook, baby. That's all you've got. All you've got is your gospel. All you've got is your preachings and your sermons. That's all you've got. Your magical book of spells, a collection of assertions and fallacies. Your textbook. That's all you've got. And unfortunately, that's not enough to convince people like me. It's not enough to convince people like my listeners who are smart and who realize that evidence is important. You haven't showed up with any bait at all, Mr. Comfort. You're sitting there with a fishing rod without any bait hanging on the end of it, and you're wondering why there's no trout catching on the hook. I mean, I'm sorry to be the one to burst your bubble here, but the idea that you consider your apologetics arguments to be bait is just absolutely crazy to me. Do they actually work? Have you ever actually convinced a genuine and intelligent atheist? Yeah, sure, you can probably convince a few morons, you could probably convince a few idiots, a few ill-informed people, but has it ever actually worked against an informed, intelligent atheist? I'm inclined to doubt it. So if this fishing analogy, if we take it to its logical conclusion, I can tell you right now that you're going to go home without any fish. It's going to be a sad day for you. You should retire. You're not the best fisherman, Mr. Comfort, and this video demonstrates exactly why. But the final thing he says is that he really just loves us and he wants to save us from hell. And so I'm going to finish, uncharacteristically perhaps, dear listener, on a positive note. But I do thank Mr. Comfort for this. At the end of the day, he is a sincere believer. It's obvious to me that Mr. Comfort really does believe what he believes. He has the courage of his convictions. He really does believe that Jesus Christ is his Lord and Savior. And it does, admittedly, warm my heart that he views his mission as a loving one, where all he's actually trying to do is save you and me from the embers and the fire and the torment and the torture of hell. And I do appreciate that that is his intention. That warms my heart. And so if you ever do see this video, Mr. Comfort, something I very much doubt, but if you do see it, that does actually mean a lot. Thank you. But just know that, well-intentioned though you might be, you have no evidence on your side. You're the fisherman without the worm at the end of the hook. You are engaged in one fallacy after another. You're engaged in one assertion after another. And like every other religious apologist, it all comes back to blind faith and preaching. What you're really engaged in here, Mr. Comfort, is a sermon. And sermons aren't going to convince philosophers and atheists like myself and my listeners. But thanks for trying. And as I said, I do appreciate your loving intent. So what do you think, dear listener? What do you think of my criticisms? What do you think of Mr. Comfort's arguments? Jump into the comments below and let me know. If you have any constructive criticism for my responses, I'd love to hear it. One of my goals in this channel is to get better at counter-apologetics, is to get better with my atheistic arguments and my responses to theists like Mr. Comfort here. So if you have any advice for me, any constructive criticism, I would love to hear it. If you're a theist and you disagree with me, I would also love to hear from you as well. I often prioritize those with whom I disagree in the comments below, so I would love to have that over and back if you'd be interested. Other than that, guys, I'd really appreciate it if you drop a like on this video. It costs you nothing and it helps out the channel enormously. But if you'd like to take one step further and support the channel financially, if you can afford to do so, of course, do consider becoming a patron today by jumping into the description box below, clicking the link to my Patreon page. When you get there, you'll be able to sign up for as little as £3 per month, and for that you'll gain access to a plethora of perks, bonuses and extras. So in closing, guys, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye bye.